Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the West Hollywood Planning Commission meeting tonight, Thursday, June 21st. This is a regular meeting here in the West Hollywood Public Park Meeting Room, also known as Council Chambers. So welcome. Call to order is done, and Pledge of Allegiance. Ed Levin, can you come up and lead us, please?
The United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, please. David?
Good evening. Tonight, Commissioner Bass is absent, so the voting will reflect that in the minutes. Commissioner Hoopengartner?
Present.
Commissioner Carvalero?
Here.
Commissioner Elchel?
Here.
Commissioner Guy?
Here.
Vice Chair Jones?
Here.
Chair Buckner?
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item is item number 4, approval of the agenda for tonight.
Moved by Commissioner Guy, seconded by Vice Chair Jones.
Thank you. We have approval of the agenda. The next item is approval of the minutes of our last meeting, which was June 7th, 2018. And we have a verbatim transcription of the draft minutes. Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion by Commissioner Guy, seconded by Vice Chair Jones. Staff does have one correction on, it was brought to our attention on page 124. It stated Commissioner Elchel made a comment, and it was actually Commissioner Guy. So staff will confirm that on the video.
Thank you. With that correction,
And the motion passes unanimously.
thank you. Next. Did you see that it was approved by all of us somehow or another, or vote?
Fine.
Okay. So the minutes will reflect that the motion was approved by all commissioners present. Next item is public comment. Do we have any people?
We have 2 public comments.
Thank you. First speaker is Dennis Gray.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Dennis Grant, a resident of West Hollywood.
Sorry.
I'm really frustrated. The city and the state are encouraging new housing, and I want to sign up. I went to convert my detached garage on Havenhurst Drive into an apartment, but I went to City Hall this afternoon and hit many and only red flags. My house is a duplex, so it doesn't qualify for the parking requirement waiver. Even more frustrating, I found out you can get around that requirement if you built your conversion illegally years ago, and now the city will allow you to make it legal without the parking requirement. I also wonder if maybe there's a lack of nuance in some of the rules. I live and work from home, and I've been living and walking and busing in West Hollywood car-free for more than 4 years. I know the laws are in place because the next owner may have a car, but I'm well established and have lived there since the early 2000s. Good indicators that I don't intend to move. Is there anything I can do? That's my question. I would appreciate any help in finding a workaround, and I hope the Planning Commission and the City Council will look again at the rules to see if tweaks are needed in your efforts to encourage new housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. We cannot comment on the speaker, but we encourage you to go back and see if you can work it out. Thank you. Next speaker is Michael Duong. Michael? What happened? Doesn't want to speak. Okay. Then that's it then, right? Okay, so we're done with the speakers' public comment at this time. There's another opportunity at the end of our meeting if you want to take a speaker's slip about some item that is not actually agendized item. Next item is number 7, Director's Report. Do we have a Director's Report? Not tonight. Okay, I think our Director's still not here, right? Items from Commissioners. Anybody? Vice Chair?
Hi, thank you. I think at our last meeting, maybe 2 meetings ago, I had announced that there were going to be public meetings about the seismic ordinance and potential implications for renters. I just wanted to make a note that the meeting that was originally scheduled for this Saturday has actually been canceled. So if you were planning to attend, the information is available on the city's website, but it has in fact been canceled. So I just wanted to flag that for everybody. That's all. Thanks.
Do you have an idea if it's been rescheduled?
I don't think that it has been, no.
Okay. All right, thank you for that announcement. Nothing on the consent calendar. We'll move on.
Excuse me.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I
Sorry,
did have
Lynn.
an item.
Thank you.
I would like to request of staff that when, like tonight, when we have zone text amendments, that in the staff report, we always include the original council directive so that we have access to that, so we know the intent that was originally issued by council when we review the content staff presents to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good suggestion. Moving on then. Anybody else before we move on? Public hearings now, moving to 10A, which is 1011 and 1015 North Crescent Heights Boulevard. For those of you who may be here for the first time or not familiar, we do have a staff report. Then we have an opportunity for commissioners to ask questions of staff with regard to the report itself. And then we have the applicant make a presentation, 10 minutes. Then we open it up for public to take a speaker slip if you want to speak on this item. And then we have a 5-minute rebuttal on part of the applicant. And then we may or may not close the public hearing and allow deliberation at that time. So we have a staff report, and would you let us know who you are?
Thank you. My name is John Mayer, Senior Planner for the City of West Hollywood. And good evening, Commissioners. The item that you have before you is item 10A, a request for a demolition permit to remove 2 single-family homes and detached garages and a development permit to build a new 3-story, 12-unit apartment structure over a subterranean parking garage. The project also involves a lot line adjustment. It would combine the 2 lots at 1011 and 1015 Crescent Heights into 1 lot. The subject site is located on the west side of Crescent Heights, just south of Santa Monica Boulevard. It's near the city's southern border with Los Angeles. The zoning designation for this area is R3A, which calls for the continued development of multifamily buildings, including apartments and condominiums. This segment of Crescent Heights is mostly developed with multifamily buildings of various heights. A majority of the developed neighborhood is 2 to 3 stories in height. Currently, there are 2 separate lots under one ownership, and each one is developed with a single-family house. The homes and detached structures are currently vacant and are not registered with the city's rent control. They're considered inactive in the city's rental database. This application also includes the lot line adjustment, which would merge these 2 lots into 1, and the total lot size would be 13,000 square feet. The proposed 12-unit apartment complex includes 7 2-bedroom units and 5 1-bedroom units. The baseline density for the site is 10 units, and under this zoning designation, the applicant is limited to 2 stories in height and 25 feet in height. But with the affordable housing unit and the density bonus, 12 units are allowed here, and the density bonus allows the applicant to build 1 additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height. The area shaded in orange is the building's footprint, and it creates the look of 2 separate buildings with a courtyard space in the middle. The front yard setback along Crescent Heights is primarily filled with a planter blocks that would have ornamental grasses and a large olive shade tree in the center. There's also a series of shade trees that would be planted along the rear property line and a portion of the side yard to the south. Pedestrian access is provided through the center of the complex, and vehicle access is provided along the south side, leading to a subterranean parking garage. Subterranean parking garage would provide 20 parking spaces. 14 of them are in tandem, and those would be reserved for the 2-bedroom units. This level also contains storage areas for bicycles, regular storage, and trash. Guest parking is not required for this project because of the affordable housing density bonus. The units themselves range in size from roughly 600 square feet to 1,200 square feet. Each unit is provided with private outdoor open spaces, and they're shown there in the yellow color. Some units have private patios on the ground floor entrances. Others have private decks on the upper levels. The central courtyard area provides approximately 1,000 square feet of common open space for the residents to use. This project was presented to the Commission's Design Review Subcommittee in January, and several improvements were made to the design. The courtyard elevations were improved compared to the original submittal. The entrances to the apartments were improved with a more strong, welcoming character. The updated design also combined individual staircases into a more inviting entry for the upper units. In addition, the doors to the ground floor units have incorporated some side lights and canopies, which help signify the entrance to each unit. This is a view of the front elevation, and there are portions of the adjacent buildings on each side to give a sense of the project fit. The applicant has also provided a 3D model there, which he will present in a moment. The exterior materials include a combination of stucco, cement board siding, and flush metal seam siding. And these are the side elevations. Now, portions of this building would encroach into a required 6-foot step back space on the second and third floors. Those are shown in the orange color on the slide. These portions of the front elevation there are portions of this building that do step back, and staff feels that the overall design creates a nice cascading set of forms that step back from the street, resulting in an exemplary design for this project. So staff is recommending approval of the application with the adoption of PC Resolution 18-1255. The project can be categorically exempt from further environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act because this is an infill development project. The project also satisfies the findings for approving the demolition and development permits. And overall, the project complies with the goals and provisions of the general plan and the municipal code. It will help the city meeting its housing goals by providing a net of 10 new residential units, including one income unit. The project's architectural and urban design elements will also enhance the streetscape along Crescent Heights Boulevard. The lot line adjustment can also be approved because there will not be a greater number of parcels than originally existed, which is one of the main requirements for a lot line adjustment approval. This concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions from the Commission.
I'd like to ask you again to tell us how you define exemplary design. What makes a particular project exemplary? I mean,
Well,
is that totally subjective? Is there any kind of objective criteria that we're looking at?
This is something that we actually talked about at the commission recently. Staff did meet this week actually with both of our contract urban designers, and we are working on a definition that we will include in our application so that we will bring back to those commission members who would like to look at that with us. But for the moment, what it means is we're not having a flat, uninteresting facade, that there is articulation and there are things that cause interest. Exemplary does not necessarily mean it needs to be of a Frank Gehry kind of, high design in that way, but a good solid building that fits into its context and still provides interest can meet that category. But we will have that further defined shortly.
Okay, I know it comes up over and over again for us, so thank you very much for doing that. Any other questions? Lynn?
Related to that, in your 2.2, on the project description, John, I think we emailed about this. I think there needs to be a correction in the conditions because this refers to a corner lot, which this is not.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. That sentence should be stricken. It will be. Okay, so condition 2.2 says, "This building design is deemed exemplary and is not required to step back portions of the upper floors facing the street, as these tall components help break down the overall mass of the project." The sentence that would be stricken is, "The building is uniquely three-dimensional and addresses the corner lot with openness and interest." And that sentence doesn't apply here.
I also was emailing about the storefronts. And in the green points, they're taking the green points for cross ventilation, et cetera, et cetera. And there seem to be a lot of fixed storefronts, and especially on the east and west sides, which is where in this town we get our breeze through east and west. So can you explain how that's been analyzed, addressed, or should we wait for the architect?
We could speak to the architect, but I did confirm with the architect that 20% of the windows in the project are operable, which is the requirement for the green points. The storefront window systems are primarily used as screening for the staircases, and I'll defer to the architect on an explanation for those.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions of staff at this time? Seeing none, then we'll move on to the applicant. I would like you to come take the podium, announce your name and who you are, where you're from.
Good evening. Thank you, commissioners and staff, for having us here tonight to review the project. I'm Derek Levitt with the architecture firm WehoTV, here to represent the project this evening. All right. Thanks, John, for the presentation. That was great, actually. He covered a lot of bases, so I'll keep this a little bit more brief then. When we approached the project, I think there were a few key important components. Obviously, analyzing the site and what is surrounding it, and then really trying to take a lot of effort to not just create a large, boxy apartment building. And there's a couple strategies we used to do that, but the primary strategy was, from the very beginning, this was designed as a courtyard-style building, and we've stuck to that throughout. We really want to embrace the sort of Southern California feel, and having the courtyard in this project is incredibly important because it creates a focal point for where most of the circulation happens in the project, where most of the entrances to the apartments occur. And really every apartment in the project gets to experience that courtyard in one way or the other, whether it's through their entry, a large window opening, their outdoor space opens to it. So getting back a little bit to the idea that there can be a community space in an apartment building, where it's not just long corridors and a large boxy building. A lot of the influence you'll see in the project is from mid-century modern. We liked the idea of relating to that, but while also creating a more contemporary, warm, modern feel. The massing of the project is really broken down into distinct elements to really reduce the overall massing of the project as described with the affordable housing incentive. We do have a third story, but that third story is greatly reduced. It's pushed back in the front, it's pushed back in the rear, and in its place, we've created a lot of outdoor spaces well above the requirements for the project. So I just wanted to review, I think the design review process with the city was incredibly valuable for this project, and I just want to thank everyone involved in that on the city side. So if you see on the left, we have the original design as presented, and then through several iterations, ended up where we are now. And some of that was some pretty key moves, we think. One of the biggest was reducing this overhanging roof. So the overhanging roof was really there to create some unity amongst the elements in the project, but it ended up becoming a little bit too cumbersome in the original design. And so it was really cut back to really just do the minimal amount of effort it needed to do without overtaking the streetscape. We also reduced some of the massing, the stair tower on the, if you're looking at the left side of the building, and a lot of really key design moves as you go throughout the project. The entries to all the units and the building itself needed a lot of work, and we feel like with the help of Design Review Board and Gwen Pugh, we really think we addressed those issues. So again, here it is looking from the other side, and you can see we got rid of this angled stair that was sort of not really in tune with the rest of the project. Really opened up this courtyard and created a lot better design moves, articulating very clearly where the elevator is. This is primarily, we think, how a lot of people are going to be getting up and down from the parking garage into their unit is coming up this elevator. And you can see on the left before, there were just some elements that weren't really working very well. These trellises were overwhelming the courtyard space. The entries were not incredibly inviting. We feel like we've made a lot of improvements on those elements. And this is looking back towards the entry in the courtyard. We've created some bench seating in the courtyard space that also doubles as planters. And again, almost every unit enters their apartment unit through this courtyard space, except for the ones facing the street. And the ones facing the street either have a patio space that faces out onto the courtyard, or have a large window opening into the courtyard. Again, a comparison from the original design to the updated design. And a look at the cross-section view through the courtyard. And back on the other side. There was also a lot of simplification of the elements. Original design had just a few too many changes, moves, changes of material, so we feel like it's become much simpler and more refined. And importance in celebrating the entry. I feel like this is where we really have the most mid-century kind of modern move. A little splash of color, but very, again, simple elements. View back to the elevator. And then the model is here. I know we can have a zoom in on the model, but we did take some photos of the model. We think it turned out really great. The landscaping, obviously, is a very important part of the project. Our landscape architect is here tonight because I am actually very terrible with landscaping, but we use experts to improve upon that situation. But it's a really important part of the project, from the feature tree in the front yard to even the street trees, the screening trees along the rear of the property, and just taking advantage of this really deep setback along Crescent Heights. Again, you can see especially the units that get up to the third floor, they have really nice large outdoor spaces. In those outdoor spaces, there was a lot of effort made during the design review process to screen them better for privacy for both adjacent neighbors and so that people don't see in and see what kind of barbecue someone has on their balcony. And as described, there is a mix of scale in the neighborhood, from some lower scale to our four-story neighbor to the north. And here's a look down the courtyard from the rear of the property. It's important to note, especially regarding the rear of the property where some of the lower scale properties are, we've set back the decks. So on the third floor, you can see that the decks have been set back so that there isn't direct views into people's yards. So essentially, a tenant in those units cannot step to the edge and really peer down. Their view is more out to preserve privacy, and then a huge row of screening trees across the rear of the project. This sort of dictates that this view is even above what you would consider eye level, but you can see through the landscaping and the stepping back of the third floor that the project impact, we feel, is minimized. Thank you.
Anybody have questions at this point of the architect? No? Okay, then we'll open it up to public comment. And do we have any speakers?
We have 2 speakers.
Okay, first speaker I see is Edward Levin, followed by George Jarsky.
Thank you, Chair. Edward Levin, resident of West Hollywood. I'm not really here to address the merits of the scheme. I think it's quite a nice design. What I'm here to talk about is the way that it's discussed in the staff report. It is absolutely correct that they can have a project of 12 units with one affordable unit. They're allowed to declare a base density of 10. One affordable unit's 10%. 10% low income gives you a 20% base density bonus. 2 units, 12 units, there you are. Staff discusses it in terms of an 11-unit project. This can't be right. If it is an 11-unit project with the base density rounding up, then it falls under the 20% requirement, and they have to provide 20% of the units affordable. But more to the point, the 11-unit calculation is done completely improperly. It says that 1 unit of 11 is 9.1%. Therefore, that rounds up to 10%. That's absolutely incorrect. What the state density bonus law says is that fractions round up when they involve units. Density calculations resulting in fractional units round up. The 10.8, that 0.8 is a fractional unit, it rounds up. 9% is not a fractional unit. 9% is 9%. That does not round up. So the calculations that you're being shown that could get them to 14 units, they're utterly irrelevant for the project, but they're completely misleading and really shouldn't be in here simply because it's going to mislead members of the public or members of the commission as to how this works. Again, the 9% does not round up to 10. Fractions only round up when they result in fractional units. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to say, ask
Lauren a question?
Excuse us, we're going to ask Lauren a question with regard to this.
Did you want to comment on that comment?
Well, that was a lot of math for one comment. I think what he was saying was it's calculated correct for this project because, what his argument was just about the math generally for maximum residential density. But this applicant has built the base project is less than the maximum density. So the math calculation for this project is correct.
Right.
The larger scale issue I'll have to talk with Ed about offline. We've spent a lot of time talking about math and density bonus, and so I can follow up with him
And the state
afterwards.
does it a little bit differently than this was done, correct? The way the state does the density bonus calculation?
This applicant is just not maxing out what they can build
They could
on the
do.
site under the density bonus law. And
Right.
so where it's rounded up doesn't impact this project. And I'll follow up with
It is
to
confusing,
talk
though.
about it.
We've been through this a few times.
Yeah, and I just want to point out as well that staff will be returning on July 19th with a zone text amendment addressing affordable housing changes that should sync up the city process to be more similar in terms of rounding up the way the state does. So this should be
So
taken
that'd be
care
more
of.
consistent with the state, so it won't be so confusing then.
Exactly.
Yes, everything
Thank
will
you.
be rounded up under the proposed text amendment.
Thank you.
So the bottom line is the calculations, however they're stated in the staff report, the project as presented is in compliance with our code and with the state law.
That is correct.
Okay. All right, so then, Mr. George Biarski, it's your turn.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is George Biarski, live in West Hollywood. I'm just going to talk as usual about the outside of the building. I didn't quite catch the fact that it was trying for exemplary status. Everybody seems to have a hard time being able to sort of pinpoint it. I don't think, well, I think the building is nice because for once, for what could have been a solid mass with some little indents, it does provide a view through, even though that view is sort of blocked by a tree, but that's okay. So it's interesting in that respect. But the rest of it, the rest of the building is I hate to use this term, but sort of an arrangement of building blocks. I don't see any difference with this building from any other of the new buildings, residential buildings that have been proposed, except for that indent. And then, lo and behold, color, my goodness. White, brown, and dark gray. Who would have thought that somebody would have come up with that color scheme? I wish I'd invested in the companies that produced this stuff. Not stucco, but the other ones. And especially the building on, I guess, the right, which is really a pretty massive block of dark gray. If somebody said to me that that part of the building looks like a maximum security detention facility, I would say no, because the building has too many windows and the inmates could escape too easily. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers at this time? Okay. How about rebuttal? Do you have anything you want to come back, the applicant? Not at this time? Okay, then I'm going to close the public hearing at this point and open it up for discussion among the commissioners. And who would like to go first? Okay, go ahead, Rogerio.
Sure. I was one of the commissioners at the Design Review Committee, so I know the evolution of this project from when I first saw it to what it is now. And yeah, I actually quite like this project. It does have its roots in mid-century modern. It even has some Bauhausian moments, and we discussed all that in the Design Review meeting, and all the adjustments that we had talked about to make it a better building have actually been implemented, and I do believe it is a good building. And I think it will bring, I do think it does bring something different to the architecture in our city, given a lot of the developments that we have seen over the last several months. So I'm in favor of this project. I don't have an issue with it.
Okay, anybody else? Well, I'll say something then, unless you want to go first, Lynn, go ahead. I also was there on design review, and my comments are still the same. There's two things about this project that I don't like, but generally I do like it. I think it's a nice project. Two things were, on the first floor, the overhead by the front doors is so small that if it's raining, which I know it doesn't rain that much in California or in Los Angeles, you'd be standing there with your key trying to open up the door, and you're going to get rained on because doesn't really cover even the step that goes into the unit. So that, for me, that is a problem. The other thing is that I think that the upper stories have sufficient private space, and it's really private, open space, but the downstairs units don't really have private open space. It's all part of the common space. It's in front of the living room window, I guess is what it is. So those are my only two objections. They're still there. It's the comments I made at design review. But all in all, I think it's a good project. And I like the fact that there's quite a few trees. I know they removed a lot of mature trees in order that were between the two individual dwellings on the lot line. But I see that there are quite a few trees that have been added into the landscape, and I appreciate that. And I think that's going to be nice. So that's my view. I'm going to support the project, but I still wish it had made those changes. Go on, Lynn. Thank you.
I too like the design. I think I like the open space, which we never see anymore. The common open space is gone for most of the projects we review, so I like how that creates a sense of community and activates the building. And the various articulations of the building, I think, are lovely. I probably do agree with George that, gee, I would love to see some color. But I know we're not supposed to get into layout, but I do have some layout concerns because I think they compromise the quality of the building. And number one is the fact that the kitchen on the two-bedroom units is on the 3rd floor. Now, I'm all for getting my steps in every day, but when I've got my arms full of milk and whatever, and I'm trying to get my groceries up the stairs, that's a pretty daunting adventure. And I kind of did a little math, and if you're parking on the one end of the building, you've got to walk the length of the building to the elevator, then you've got to go up the elevator, then you've got to go across the courtyard, all the way back across the courtyard again, and then up 2 flights of stairs, and then all the way across the room to get to the kitchen to put your stuff in the refrigerator. And to me, that just doesn't speak good design. It's certainly not ADA compliant. Obviously, there's smaller units on the ground floor, and that are ADA compatible, et cetera, et cetera. So that was just one comment, and the other was, I feel like it's just not a good use of space. On the 1-bedrooms, they're creating this sort of hallway in order to put the bathroom in the corner and make a suite concept, but it's a 1-bedroom unit. The bathroom could be pushed into the living space, so it's adjacent to the living space, so that a guest wouldn't have to go through your bedroom to get to the bathroom, and it would free up all of that hallway space for actual living space and bedroom space. So these are just some design things that I saw that I feel could fundamentally improve the functionality of the space and the effective usability of the space. And those are my comments.
Any other comments, Stacy?
Sure, thanks. Without kind of repeating what my fellow commissioners have said, notably Chair Buckner and Commissioner Hoopengarner, I do like the courtyard design. I appreciate they haven't kind of built it out to the full size that it could be, which is often what we see. I do like the courtyard design. I don't necessarily feel that it's as accomplished as elegantly as it might be. I also am not a huge fan of kind of the personal or private space in the courtyard, because it's basically a planter row, but I'm generally inclined to support the project.
No comments? Mr. Alshold? Commissioner Alshold?
I agree with everybody else in supporting the project. I do think the color schemes seem to change on every rendering in color that I've seen. But all of that, I think, is up to the developer as to what they want. And it's sort of a First Amendment right. With respect to the interior layout, I think some of these comments have been very appropriate. However, again, it's a matter of a First Amendment right, and if these are rentals, some of the prospective tenants may take offense at some of the items that were called out as being not particularly user-friendly, and some of them may not. But I think overall it provides wonderful additional housing, and it'll work.
Okay. Then I'll entertain a motion.
Motion by Commissioner Hoopengarner, seconded by Commissioner Carvalero. And the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
The resolution the Planning Commission just approved memorializes the Commission's final action on this matter. This action is subject to appeal to the City Council. Appeals must be submitted within 10 calendar days from this date to the City Clerk's office. Appeals must be in writing and accompanied by the required fees. The City Clerk's office can provide appeal forms and information about waiver of fees.
Thank you. Staff settled? Do we need a few minutes, or are you okay? Yeah? All right, then we'll move on to the next public hearing, which is item 10B, zone text amendment having to do with live, work, home businesses. I think we have a staff report.
Hi, good evening. Chair Buckner and commissioners.
Yes.
Do we want to wait on Lynn or?
Yeah, it's okay. She'll come out. Would you state your name and your?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tara Warden. I'm an assistant planner here with the Long Range Planning Team at the City of West Hollywood. Tonight, I will be presenting proposed changes to the zoning code regarding home businesses and live-work regulations. As a reminder, council directed staff to evaluate home businesses and live-work regulations to determine a policy direction that would better address the needs of residents and the changing economy. So, due to the advances in technology and communications, businesses now have the opportunity to operate anywhere within the city. We have seen the rise of the maker movement, spurring boutique online stores and brick and mortar retail giving way to e-commerce. This new economy has forced us to look at developing new regulations to retain small creative businesses, incubate startups and artists, and enhance work-from-home options. So just a brief timeline. I know this item has been before you previously. So in October, when we last received input to conduct further research from the commissioners, we then presented later at council in December of 2017, and then a follow-up item was presented to council in March, where we received specific direction from council that was included in the staff report. Staff drafted proposed changes for the long-range subcommittee to review and received your input to revise the language. The item before you tonight reflects the direction from council and the input received from the commissioners. So council specifically requested that staff increase the number of employees allowed in home businesses from 1 to 2. And then in regards to live work, we were directed to require commercial uses on the ground floor of a live work unit, reduce the parking standards, amend the design standards to allow for more flexibility, and then address affordability. So let's move on to the home businesses portion of this. Home businesses are businesses permitted to operate out of a residence, provided that they do not negatively impact the residential character and the peaceful enjoyment of the property by other residents. Data from the Business Tax Certificate database shows that home businesses are located throughout the city's residential neighborhoods, and there's a total of 1,245 home businesses currently in West Hollywood. We propose amending the operating standards of the home business ordinance to allow for 2 employees in addition to the owner on the premises between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. The potential positive impacts of this amendment could provide home businesses the ability to scale up their operations without incurring additional overhead costs associated with leasing office space. On the other hand, this could result in an increase in parking demand on residential streets. These impacts, however, are seen as being offset by the benefit of keeping and growing local businesses in the city. And moving along to live work. So the intent of the live work ordinance is to provide for and make feasible the creation of alternative workspace that will provide an incentive for entrepreneurs, business owners, artists, artisans, architects, designers, and other individuals to contribute to work in West Hollywood and continue to work in the city of West Hollywood and contribute to the city's economy. So I'm going to review the changes that are proposed in the ordinance or the resolution that was provided to you in the staff report. The first change, there's 3 changes to the design standards and 1 change to the parking standard. The first change to the current ordinance removes the requirement for the first 50 feet of floor area depth at the street level frontage to be limited to commercial retail sales. This change also removes the exception applied to live-work projects in the R3CC and R4BC zoning districts, as the change will be enacted in all zones where live-work units are allowed. So the item, the R3CC, R4BC, some of those changes that we enacted just recently will be amended if this resolution is approved. The second proposed change introduces a flexible standard that can be applied to live-work units depending on the vision of the development project and the architect and the intent of the project at large. Additional proposed changes serve to clean up this section, which initially applied only to live-work units in the R3CC and R4BC zones. This standard applied requires a minimum of 20% and a maximum of 50% of the gross floor area to be designated and used as workspace. These numbers aren't arbitrary, rather they were informed by the California Building Code, which requires no more than 50% of a live-work unit to be used as workspace, and the lower threshold of 20% was influenced by the Federal Housing Authority's policy regarding mortgage insurance, which stipulates that live-work units qualify for FHA mortgage insurance only if the workspace does not occupy more than 25% of the gross floor area. The third proposed change to the design standards cleans up the language and addresses the requirement for the commercial use on the ground floor to read, each live-work unit on the ground floor fronting a public street shall have a pedestrian-oriented frontage that publicly displays the commercial use on the interior of the structure. And then the last proposed change addresses parking requirements. Staff recommends the commercial parking standard, parked at 3.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, be removed and replaced with two separate standards. One for live-work units included in new development, parked at 1 space per unit, and another standard that does not require any parking for live-work units that are a part of projects that reuse an existing building. These two approaches reflect the intent of the initial council direction to incentivize live-work units and to make it easier and more affordable to redevelop older existing buildings that may not have parking on site. In regards to affordability, the live-work units are required to pay a commercial linkage fee in lieu into the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That does not mean that there will be live-work units that are designated Capital A affordable, because this is a commercial use, and the affordable housing requirements only apply to residential uses. So, with that said, the proposed zone text amendment provides more flexible design standards and allows for expanded types of commercial uses in addition to retail. So we suggest that the significant reduction in parking standards and the provision of flexible design standards in part will provide flexibility in the types of live-work units being developed, and thus providing a wider range of live-work price points on the real estate market. And we continue to monitor the real estate trends in West Hollywood and the affordable housing policies. So we're trying to stay on top of everything in regards to the live-work units. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Go ahead. I just have a question. We're trying to get people to drive less and park less, but if they're going to have two employees plus the resident owner of the project, that's 3 people who could potentially park a car, and there's on a residential street, and we're now not requiring any parking, even in an older building that may not have parking. It doesn't seem consistent with the other changes that we're making with regard to parking and driving and so far. I was thinking that, and especially in a residential area, they've got work hours from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. A lot of people are coming home from working outside of their home by 6 or so, 5 or 6, and they can't find parking because we're going to have people parking that are employees. So why not have a special parking day use parking permit that would only go to employees to use during the daytime and not be able to park after 6 p.m.? And so they would be able to park during the day when many of our residents are moving their cars outside of the city to go work somewhere else. And then by the time they come back, then those parking spaces would be freed up. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. I think, so the first comment that you made about the parking for live work, let's just keep in mind that home businesses and live work are very separate. Home businesses are allowed in residential zones, and live work are units that are allowed only in commercial zones, in addition to the R3, CC, R4BC zones. And your comment about the parking in regards to the stress on residential streets, given an increase in number of employees. From my understanding and from what we've determined in coordination with the parking division, is that each unit is given 4 guest passes for parking in the street. And those guest passes can provide parking passes for any potential employees that these home businesses might have.
They're going to have 4 parking instead of 2?
You're already provided 4 guest passes.
Commercial? 2. 2, only 2.
Oh, 2. Pardon
2
me.
stickers on a car and two passes.
Oh, 4 total, yes.
Yeah.
Just paid my bill, I know.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know, just seems inconsistent to me, but go ahead, John.
What control do, say, owners of apartment buildings or HOA organizations have over the numbers of live-work units in a residential complex?
Again, live-work units are a commercial use. They're not going to be in a residential complex. They would be typically incorporated into a mixed-use project or in standalone live-work projects that occur only on commercial
Only in
land.
commercial zones?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
So, first of all, I just would like to clarify, at long-range planning, when this came up, we recommended the idea of keeping the treatment of adaptive reuse of existing buildings for live work separate from new builds. And in staff report, it just referred to that in parking only. But I think our intent was, in all aspects, adaptive reuse has different requirements, different issues than new build. So I just want to make sure we keep that in mind in this conversation. I think we perhaps need some tightening on the language about ground floor commercial, and make sure that all live work is in fact ground floor. Because if it's not ground floor, it becomes a home-based business. It's a residential unit up above with no public access for the commercial space. And whether it, you can get into the nuances of, if it's an interior courtyard, but that still has ground floor commercial access. But if you just have a large unit, which these can be up to 3,000 square feet, somewhere up in a large mixed-use building, it's not really live work, it's a home-based business. And I think that's an important distinction to make, especially given the potential for underparking 3,000 square feet. I saw a scenario where you could take a commercial frontage, decide to make it all live work, like 5 units next to each other, 3,000 square feet each, 1 parking space for 15,000, well, 5 parking spaces for 15,000 square feet. And so if that's up high in a building, you've now just added 15,000 square feet of essentially residential, not really commercial, and it's underparked. So I want to make sure that we mitigate the risk of that. And the 750 square feet minimum, I definitely agree we need a minimum. But let's see, at 20%, that's 150 square feet. It's a small, but doable, I guess. But back to the parking. Yes, the goal is to incentivize live work by reduced parking requirements. But again, per California Building Code, these can be up to 3,000 square feet. That's a big space. And they could have up to 5 employees. That's a lot of parking need. That's not counting the potential customer needs for that live work space. I would like to recommend that we consider one parking space per 1,000 square feet with a minimum of 1, and this is for the new builds, obviously. That seems to me reasonable. The current code says 3.5 per live workspace per 1,000. So that's still significantly less parking, but I think it's more practical given the potential size of these units. So that would be my recommendation. The other part of the parking on the adaptive reuse, I think it's important.
Lynn?
Yeah?
I think I may have made a mistake, and I didn't open it up for public speakers. Are there any speakers before we go further?
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
We do, we have one.
oh,
You
sorry.
have one.
Okay,
Can we
so-
hold that
Sure,
till we
sure,
let our
absolutely,
public speakers
absolutely.
come forward? And I do
thought we were-
apologize. Thank you for the reminder.
That would be Edward Levin.
Thank you, Ed, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Edward Levin, resident of West Hollywood. There's a lot of confusion over what live, work, and home business is. First of all, staff's not completely correct. Live, work is a residential use in the building code. That's why you can't have 60% of the use as non-commercial, as commercial space, as non-residential use. But to build on what staff was saying in the design standards about pedestrian-oriented frontage, that ought to be the deciding factor. If it has pedestrian-oriented frontage, it can be live work. Anything else should be home business, home office, whether that's in a residential zone or whether that's the residential upper floors of a mixed-use project. We should not allow live work to be defined as just a different kind of residential unit on an upper floor to be able to game the system and say we only have 1 parking space and we can do 3,000 square feet. So it's really quite simple. We need to separate what is a residential unit, and most of this is going to be residential units. Home office works fine. 2 employees works fine. When you require that the mixed-use project not allow live work in its upper floors, you now are treating them as residential units with the residential parking standards, and the parking problem goes away. Live work should only be defined as spaces that have a pedestrian-oriented frontage, whether that's directly on the sidewalk, whether it's a courtyard, it could be a second-floor gallery in some situations, but that ought to be what live work is. And that makes everything quite simple at that point. But live work is, in fact, a residential use in the building code. That's really quite clear. So live work is a way of doing a residential use that's quasi-commercial in a commercial zone. But again, it should be limited to pedestrian-oriented frontage. I agree with Commissioner Hoopengarter that 1 car per 1,000 makes sense. We aren't getting them now because 3.5 per 1,000 is ludicrous. But by the same token, there also needs to be some proportionality to it. So that's really that's really it. I think the rest makes sense. Eliminating the 50-foot depth for retail makes perfect sense. 2 employees in a home business is something I've been pushing for about 5 or 10 years now. because I have a home business. I'm one of those 1,245, have been for the last 15 years or more. But we simply have to eliminate the confusion of what the difference is between live work and a home office. If it's pedestrian-oriented frontage, live work is perfect. If it doesn't have that, it's a home office. If it's the upper floor of a mixed-use building, that's a home office. Just that simple. So, with that, and the other thing I would say is that right now the building code defines 50% as the upper limit. Staff says 20% is an arbitrary it of course is arbitrary. What the building code says is anything less than 10% is an ancillary use. It's an auxiliary use. You don't even bother to count it. It says live work is in effect anywhere between 10 and 50%. And I think that's what we ought to adopt, because the less we design in conflicts between what the building code says and what our zoning ordinance says, the less conflicts we design into our zoning ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other speakers at this point?
That's all.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Lynn.
Okay, so we discussed the parking, adaptive reuse parking. I'm concerned, yes, I'm all for if you don't have it, you don't have to add parking. But if you do have it, you're not allowed to let it go away. I'm thinking of Laurel Hardware. They had parking, it went away. Now, that's not a live-work scenario, but it was an adaptive reuse of an existing facility. So, I'm sure legal can help craft the language, but something to address the fact that if there's existing parking on the site, that whatever you're doing to adapt the building wouldn't remove that parking, just because you now don't have to have parking for a live-work space. That would be my concern. Does that make sense?
Like no net loss of parking spaces.
Correct.
Yeah, I'll look in the non-conforming ordinance, because there might already be a provision that says you
Right.
can't make a use more
So
non-conforming.
existing
Let me look.
non-conforming would be fine, just you can't disappear that parking because you no longer would be required to have it under this live-work ordinance. That just would be one of my recommendations. Did staff look at issues around maximum project size or maximum amount of live work as a total percentage of a project and what the implications might be?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean, like in terms of calculating a sort of scenario of
Yeah, just looking at
development.
different scenarios. My brain is just kind of ticking around, and I haven't quite been able to resolve it, but the issue of potentially having a very large project where a huge chunk of it was live work. I don't know. I'm just wondering, but just back to scenarios, sort of what we were talking about earlier today, Bianca, that
I think the council direction was to find ways to encourage live work, so we didn't necessarily explore ways to limit it.
no, I'm not necessarily saying limit, but just the potential implications of consequences of doing it that might have some sideways consequences that we're not thinking through. That was the thought there. Let's see, we talked about minimum unit size, directly connected, ground floor. I think that gets most of my issues. And other than, while it's hard to codify design, is there something that we should be addressing in this live work that says that it's got a reasonable work area separated from a living area, or I don't know, but as opposed to whatever.
I think we explored some different scenarios, but settled on this percentage range of workspace, and think Ed has been sort of integral in helping develop these standards. we landed on the 20% as a minimum because the council issued concerns about the reversion of live-work units to more of a traditional residential unit. And staff thought maybe by requiring a higher threshold of workspace being allocated to a designated use of an office or work area, that would maybe inhibit the likelihood of it being reverted to residential units. But other than that, we didn't necessarily explore design standards that would, in more detail, dictate what was needed. We tried to make it flexible.
Right, and we discussed this at long-range planning, which I would say is definitely a concern, although probably not a real concern, given that it's commercial frontage, which is pretty pricey in this town. So the odds of that reverting to residential, maybe not high, but I think it's certainly something to be concerned about.
Anybody else want to make comment or questions? No? Do you want to make I guess we're just going to recommend that this move forward to council, is that correct? With our comments? I don't think that we need to vote on anything.
You could recommend changes to the language should the commission choose to do that, or you could recommend approval or denial of the resolution.
Yeah. Sorry, Lynn's made a motion. No. Go ahead and state your motion, because I want to make sure that if you do make a motion that I can address the points.
Well, I would move that we move this forward to council with the parking amendment that I requested on the 1,000, one space per 1,000 for new build, and the protection of the existing non-conforming parking on an adaptive reuse. I think, and I'd have to check, I had a problem because the way it's presented in the staff report is a bunch of edits, but not the whole text, so I had a hard time rebuilding it. So the concern, to be clear, that it's ground floor commercial, pedestrian access.
So just to clarify, are you saying that you want all the live work units to have ground floor access?
Yes.
I agree.
But I think more specifically than ground floor access,
As
if
it be
I'm,
public.
that it needs to have a pedestrian facing frontage, correct?
Pedestrian facing frontage, but with the exception of, let's say, if it's in a courtyard break-in or something that's part of the building frontage. I'm thinking like, you know, where the sports bar is.
The sports bar? Oh.
You know, it's like a courtyard space.
By Five Guys?
Yeah, by Five Guys. So that's, you know, it's not street frontage per se, but it's a courtyard space, but that could be a live-work space type design that has pedestrian access. It's ground floor commercial. It's just not all flat up against the street.
Instead of pedestrian access, could we perhaps consider pedestrian orientation frontage?
Sure.
Because everything has pedestrian access.
Yeah, and this is, I'll second the motion with, you know, commenting on, you know, we're going to end up with 3,000 square foot units on, you know, the top floor. Those are just 3,000 square foot apartments, you know, they'll call it live work, but someone's just going to live there and then have a desk and be like, you know, here's my home office.
And it's going to be severely underparked.
It's like one parking space for 3,000 feet.
We would end up with a bunch of huge live-work spaces with no parking.
I know. I listen, I'm all for reducing parking requirements because I think, you know, and I've made that publicly known, but this is, yeah, a little
too much.
A little too much.
Can I ask a question of staff as regards the percentage? Because I think Commissioner Hoopengarner and Mr. Levin, I think, very eloquently kind of summed up my concerns, my primary concerns about it. But the 10 to 50%, I mean, is there a reason that wouldn't align, that we wouldn't align our recommendation to the building code? Just, I feel like it sets us up for less potential conflicts.
I think the concern was that 10% of the minimum unit size, which is 750 square feet, would only be 75 square feet set aside for workspace, and that's...
What dictates the 750 square feet?
That's the minimum unit size that's currently in the code.
Could we change the minimum unit size?
Could, but the research that's been done previous to this meeting indicated that that's sort of the smallest that you would want to go, and in terms of the
750 square feet?
right, and the market prices, if we're trying to attempt at some affordable units for a live work, that would be
Affordable lowercase a,
yes,
not uppercase a?
right, just
Okay.
in terms
Just
of
to be clear.
a market
Okay.
price variation.
Okay.
That would be sort of the lowest end that you could combine a work and live space.
Okay. I'm going to reference Pygmy Hippo Shop if you haven't been. It's just north of Beverly, and it's literally the tiniest store you'll ever go to in your entire life. That's why it's called the Pygmy Hippo Shop. But I'm just putting that forth as an option because they've really made it work. My preference would be that we make it 10 to 50%, but I'm open to hearing my fellow commissioners' comments on that.
Well, my initially I wrote in my notes, it should be at least 800 or 900 square feet so that you could go to 10% and have a reasonable workspace. But Tara, I think, makes a good point about we want to make these affordable. And if you create a minimum that's too high, then you've got something that's no longer affordable. But we want to make sure it's also practical and achieves the goal of having real commercial space in this live-work zone. 75 square feet, gee, I don't know, I mean, it's a desk, it's a printer.
Oh. Well, if you go to like a WeWork, those co-working spaces, those offices are like 60, 70 square feet. But I don't disagree, yes.
So the minute you put in a couple chairs for your clients or whatever, it's a very tiny space. So certainly wouldn't recommend going below 750. If I had my druthers, it would be more like 800 or something, just enough to just give it a little bit more real practical working space. The only way I think 10% works, which is great because then it would be in conformance with the state code, is if you have a larger minimum size, because otherwise 10% just doesn't make any sense at all. So I'm open to suggestions.
There's a motion on the floor.
Yeah, there is a motion and a second, I believe, right?
Could I ask a clarifying question? So the requirement for ground floor commercial activation access units would prohibit live-work units from being on floors above the ground floor?
Correct. It doesn't mean you couldn't have a stacked
So
live
vertical
work.
oriented.
You could have a vertical oriented, but the ground floor would have to be publicly accessible
Otherwise, you're just making 3,000 square foot units on a higher floor.
with no parking.
The one concern I would love to share with you is that through interviews with developers, the commercial square footage, you can sell it for a lot more than residential square footage. And the fear is that if you require live work on the ground floor, you're not going to get any live work units because you're always going to be able to receive more money from a commercial tenant than a live work tenant.
Which is why the stacked environment works.
And I understand that, but then if that's the case, then that developer should just build a commercial project or just a standard mixed-use project and not avail himself of the ability to have 3,000 square foot units, which is with one parking space above that. So I understand that it would be very favorable for a developer, and I am a developer. So this is to my detriment, but we have to do what's in the best interest of the city. And you know, this is obviously this is great for a developer.
Okay, so just to be clear, though, the vertical oriented live work units would be allowed as long as
Absolutely.
the ground floor activation was
There has to be ground floor activation.
I mean,
Because
think of old school New York, you know, the bakery on the ground floor, you know, the flat up above, you know, that. In fact, when we had this discussion about the Fairfax properties, that was the original goal of the general plan, and it's what we all discussed about the Fairfax properties, is it was 2 stories, could be ground floor retail and upper floor residential. So I don't think there's anything to prevent that, but it is critical that there is actual ground floor workspace the commercial space. Otherwise, you're just building a very large, underparked residence.
You mentioned pedestrian access only from the street or via courtyard?
Via courtyard, like, I don't mind like that idea.
Yeah,
of
there's
right.
hundreds of examples around the city where you have access from the street with units to the back that have a workspace at the ground level. So are you limiting that?
No.
Right,
I couldn't hear what you said.
I wouldn't want to limit that.
No,
Just
she's included that, and I second it.
because you mentioned street frontage,
Tara, can you
including
pull up the
courtyard.
presentation just quickly? I think,
Sorry.
or David, sorry, there was Rogero, just to add to what you're saying, I think that there was a very well-defined, in one of these slides, kind of definition of, I think it was like, had to show the interior from the street or something.
That's the design standard 1A with the,
No, that's not it.
the street
Here
frontage.
it is, yeah. Each live-work unit on the ground floor fronting a public street shall have a pedestrian-oriented frontage that publicly displays the commercial use on the interior.
The only problem with this language, though, is it says if it's on the public street, and we're saying it must be on a public street.
I was going to add a sentence to that part, a separate sentence, which I'll read to you, but I'm interested in hearing the rest of this
Well, there is a motion
conversation.
on the floor, so if we're going to change the language on the motion, we need.
Right.
Well, I think
Well,
well,
she's
she's
gonna
going to
need to make the
articulate my
motion.
language for me in good legal words.
Right. So, but let's finish this thought about the activation so I can write that second piece.
I don't think that, I
Or
don't
do
know
you
that
like
we
it
want to
how it
limit
is?
it to being on a street.
No, so I'll make it simple. All live work units shall be accessible from the ground floor.
Okay, yeah, that I'm going to add.
Right. But that also, that would be a catch-all for, like, if you had an interior courtyard, as long as it's accessible from the
The
ground floor.
commercial space shall be accessible from the ground
Correct.
floor.
The commercial space.
The commercial space shall be accessible from
Right,
the
so
ground
I wrote it slightly differently. I wrote, each live work unit shall have commercial use on the ground floor of the structure,
Right.
period. Do you want to keep the second sentence about?
Well, I just want to make sure that it's clear that it's not like a separate, not to say that it's even possible, but that it's a separate commercial space on the ground floor, and they have, let's just say, 2 spaces. Does that make sense? Just that the commercial space is all on the ground floor.
But these could be
Contiguous.
townhomes.
Right, townhomes.
It's contiguous. It's a single
contiguous.
space.
It's one unit
One
that has 2
unit.
types of uses inside.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
With the commercial on the ground floor.
Yes,
Yes.
commercial use on the ground floor of the structure. Is there a concern with that sentence as it exists? If we add the sentence we just read? Each live-work unit on the ground floor fronting a public street shall have a pedestrian-oriented frontage that publicly displays the commercial use. So the commercial use is now required on your ground floor, and the second sentence says it has to have a pedestrian-oriented frontage if you're on a street.
I think we don't want to limit it to a street, though. Maybe Rogerio, I want to let Commissioner Caballero explain what he means, because I don't want to bogart his time on.
Because if it's a
Well,
courtyard, you
I-
can go and walk in and see that there's a
If
lot
I'm-
of businesses are built around a courtyard.
If I'm understanding this, I would change it to each live-work unit on the ground floor shall have a pedestrian-oriented frontage that publicly displays the commercial use on the interior of the structure, not have fronting on a public street.
Yeah, that's a simple fix.
But we also want to make sure all the units have.
Yes, I'm going to add the sentence
The
in
shall
front of
word
that.
isn't important.
Yes. So, okay,
Yes.
for,
Oh,
he can't speak.
Unfortunately, we can't do
public
that.
hearings.
If you want to go up and talk to staff quietly.
Okay, so section 1936, 160, B4? We'll read, each live-work unit shall have commercial use on the ground floor of the structure. Each live-work unit on the ground floor shall have a pedestrian-oriented frontage that publicly displays the commercial use on the interior of the structure. Okay.
Good.
Then the parking, the motion would be for, as part of new development, 1 space per 1,000 square feet.
Correct.
That's the motion. And then the next sentence, with respect to no net loss, It's kind of built into the non-conforming chapter, but I could propose language that says something like this. When an existing structure is reused as live work, no space is required for the live work units, provided that non-conforming buildings cannot increase a parking nonconformity if there are any other uses in the building. So they can't take their spaces and make
Correct.
them go away
Correct.
if there's other uses that need those spaces in the building. Okay. Was there more changes? I've been focused
No,
on
I
this
think
too.
that we got the 2 parking issues and the pedestrian-oriented commercial. I think that gets it.
I just I have one comment on the motion, which is, I remember we had our vote on the R4BC and the R3CC, and we came up with a recommendation, and when it went to council, I don't know if our recommendation was, adequately presented. So I just want to make sure that if whichever way this goes, if we have a recommendation that council does hear it, because, it sounds like we all kind of agree on this and feel rather strongly about it, so
I
just want to
would
make sure they hear
concur.
it.
We had a unanimous vote on that item, and that kind of went
Yeah,
missing.
got lost.
So,
In other words, we'd like council to know how we arrived at this.
Yes,
and
we'll make
why
sure
we
to do
feel
that.
it strongly.
Thank you.
Motion by Commissioner Herbengunner, seconded by Commissioner Guy.
Thank you. I've been asked for
And the motion passes unanimously.
sorry. I've been asked for a 10-minute break, so we'll do that, and
All
then
we
we'll
have
come.
to do is just one more item.
I know,
a
but
little
their
bit additional.
commissioners have asked for a break, so I'm going to give a break. 5 minute.
5 minutes.
5-minute break. Can we call the meeting back to order, please, and move on to our next item? Moving on to item 10C, zone text amendment regarding parking incentives for program car share. Rachel Diamond.
Good evening, Rachel Diamond, Senior Planner in the Long Range Planning Division. Thank you so much. This evening, you have before you a zone text amendment to create a parking incentive program for car share. So tonight, what we're asking is that you take action on the subject resolution number PC 181266, which would make a recommendation to the City Council for that subject zone text amendment. So basically what we're doing is creating a program that would incentivize having car share in private development. Car share, if you don't know, is a service that allows participants to rent cars for short periods of time, often by the hour. Zipcar is a really common company that we have here in the city of West Hollywood. They've probably been around the longest, but there are a number of companies that have come to market. The car share services can be really beneficial to reducing household car ownership and vehicle miles traveled. They alleviate parking and traffic congestion. They increase transportation options for people, especially those who are least likely to own a car. And they can reduce use and dependence on fossil fuels through fuel efficiency in cases where electric vehicles are being used. So essentially, we had a directive from council that went to council twice. So rather than kind of walk you through the process that occurred, the final direction from council was to provide a reduction in parking requirements for buildings that provide car share on site, and those buildings need to have a residential component, again, that provide car share vehicles on the site. And it would require that the operator of the building ensure that there's a car share organization that's actually operating a car share business in those parking spaces. So the spaces would be preferential, and then they would be required to maintain a relationship with a car share organization to place cars in that location. And they would also need to be accessible 24 hours to not only residents of the building, but also to the community at large, so that there could be a benefit to the greater community instead of just the building itself. So basically what staff did is present a regulation that applies to buildings with at least 10 residential units that meet their affordable housing requirements on site or new hotels. And the reason that staff expanded it to such, we talked to the Long Range Subcommittee, and they had suggested that the affordable housing requirements be met on site for residential. And we also felt that hotels were kind of an optimal way to also capture people who are out of town. Instead of having them drive cars, they would have easier access to car share. And I believe there are 2 hotels within the city that already have car share within their buildings, and those are on the more successful side of the car share cars because they have not only people from the community, but also kind of a heavy rotation of hotel guests that utilize the service. And we are finding that less and less people that are coming that are hotel guests are bringing cars, and they're opting to use alternative transportation like this. So basically what the proposed regulations would allow you to do is for every 1 car share parking space that you provide on your site, you would be able to reduce 2 regular parking spaces. And the maximum number of spaces you could replace would be 4 parking spaces. So basically, if you provide 2 car share spaces, you could replace 4 regular spaces. So it would be a reduction of 2 total spaces. We didn't want to expand it to more than that. Certainly a building could provide more car share in their excess parking spaces, but we didn't want to have more because the reality is, we want these sprinkled throughout the city to provide kind of a wide range of coverage and blanket coverage rather than kind of a concentration of parking spaces in any one location. And particularly for these smaller buildings with 10 residential units, we didn't want to start eating up too much parking. So there are a number of design standards that are associated with the proposed zone text amendment, particularly the location. So the spaces need to be close to pedestrian access to the garage. The parking space dimensions need to be a minimum of a standard parking space, so there's no compact spaces. We want to at least have most cars fit in these parking spaces, and so having it be a standard space is really essential. Just a reminder that residential buildings already require all standard spaces, but we want to make sure that these particularly are standard. We also added a requirement for EV charging within each of those spaces so that each space have at least a level 2 electric vehicle charger. If you're unfamiliar with electric vehicle charging, there's levels 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is what I have in my garage, and it's literally a plug into a regular 110. I would not suggest it. It's extremely painful, but good for a backup. Level 2 is what we see in this garage where my car is right now charging, and it takes about 3 hours to get kind of mostly a full charge for most vehicles. And then the level 3 charger, which you can find within the city of West Hollywood in the Mel's parking lot, which is amazing, 45 minutes to 80%. Those are really expensive, so we certainly don't want to put something too onerous on someone, but we really wanted to make sure that we provide the opportunity for car share companies to use electric vehicles. We don't want to require them to because, again, we want to provide the flexibility in car type. So what happens is the car share company actually kind of keeps track of, in different neighborhoods, what cars work. Sometimes a neighborhood is really Prius focused where people just need quick rides and they're not necessarily hauling a lot of stuff. But in some cases, and in the city of West Hollywood, we have some use for kind of smaller cargo type vans and things like that. And I think some companies have sports cars. And, so there's kind of a range of what people are looking for, but we want the EV option to be open. I think what's also helpful is that most of these level 2 chargers have a really long extension cord, so that if the car share company is not utilizing electric vehicles, that charger could be used the space over. So you could also, the building could kind of utilize that to help charge other vehicles within the structure, and there can be kind of the ability to spring off of that base to have more chargers, so it would be easier for them to accommodate more electric vehicles in the building. Just as an aside, there is one company that will come in, all of their cars are electric. When they come into a private building, they provide the infrastructure automatically, and no matter what, when they leave the building, if their agreement falls apart or if they decide it's not working for some reason on either end, the infrastructure stays. And so the building is also able to maintain that infrastructure in perpetuity, even if, for example, the car share doesn't stay in place, 30 years from now or something. There are a number of operational standards that we put in place, and these are really important to make sure that we're targeting the right type of car share. So we specifically define car share organization as owning, managing, maintaining, and insuring vehicles. And I'll tell you why. There are a number of car share organizations that essentially serve as brokers to help facilitate private short-term leasing of your car. So while I'm sitting in this meeting, I could basically have my car registered on a site that would allow someone to come pick it up from the garage and take it and then just bring it back before I'm done, so I make $5 or $10. That's not what we're looking for here. We're really looking for cars that are 24/7 available for public access, that are not individually owned by a person that may once in a while want to lease them out when they're not busy or not being used, but instead have these be true fleet vehicles that are 100% car share. The car share cars would be required to have 24-hour public access. So we would work with developers to make sure that not only they have security, but then also access. Typically what buildings do is they have a key code, and they can set up the keypad to have individual key codes every single time someone gets a reservation for that building. They would get a new code that would allow them access, and then when they came back, the code would change for the next user. We would require that the building have a contract with a car share organization that they provide to the city on an annual basis. This is fairly similar to some of our other parking standards where people can lease spaces outside of their building. We require them to provide us with an annual lease, so we have a kind of internal system for accepting those things and maintaining records. And then procedures for non-compliance. So picture a new residential building comes in, they swap out 4 regular spaces for 2 car share spaces, and they maintain cars in those car share spaces for 10 years. And then suddenly, or maybe less, we'll say, but suddenly they can't find a car share organization that wants to maintain cars in those spaces any longer. Perhaps the market has changed, perhaps the company has gone out of business. There's a number of things that could happen, and we just want to make sure that we're able to figure out a way to mitigate that issue and mitigate that loss of parking. because only some people are going to be able to actually build new parking. We really opened this up to a number of options. So what they could do is they can build new parking spaces, typically really difficult, but you could also use mechanical lifts to make that work. To stack spaces, certainly the building would have to have the ceiling height to accommodate that. It's 13 feet. Most garages don't have 13 feet of clearance, but if it's, there are sometimes like 1 or 2 spaces that might meet that. Some buildings just have that clearance. They could also buy parking credits when they're in a parking credit district. They could get a shared parking permit, which would basically, they would evaluate how much parking they really need. And let's say they realize they didn't need as much parking, they could show us that there is that lack of need and get a shared parking permit to accommodate a reduction in parking. They could utilize other reductions in parking requirements. They could potentially lease off-site parking, which is also part of that shared parking permit. They could also provide car share memberships to tenants in the building to then utilize car share spaces elsewhere in the city and in general. And we really wanted to keep it general, other similar mechanisms as approved by the director to allow for flexibility and creative solutions to what could be, a potential problem if someone loses their car share organization backing. One last thing, I think it's really important for a user to be able to find these cars. It's easy when you live in a building to know where you're going. It's not when you've never been there, particularly if you're a guest of the city, or someone who's new to the system. So we wanted to make sure there was signage for this, because this isn't a typical storefront business, so they wouldn't necessarily be allowed to have any signage under today's signage provisions. So the proposed zone text amendment includes a provision that would allow up to 3 square feet per frontage. So any frontage that's on a street, they could have 3 square feet to identify that there is car share in the building. So that's really it. The requested action is to adopt resolution number 18-1266. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Hi, I just have one question. I just want to clarify, I was looking over notes from Long Range, and I just want to clarify in regard to attachment A. I think it's page 5 of 7. It's car share vehicles and dedicated car share parking space. We had talked about there being no compact and no tandem. It's full-size spaces only. I see that it's included here as covered, dedicated, standard-size parking spaces. Can we, or would you recommend that we not allow tandem parking spaces for car share? I mean, I feel like it couldn't be just by nature of what it is, but I also want to make sure that we're actually specifying.
I think it's totally reasonable to specify non-tandem.
Okay. So, but does a standard space?
It does in the residential buildings, but hotel would allow the tandem spaces. So I think that that's where you might have a tandem circumstance. You're not allowed to have tandem parking in a residential building.
Really?
In a multifamily. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. Just kidding. So yes, let's specify.
But a standard space is a non-compact space, as defined by the code, correct?
Yes, a standard space is not a compact space.
Okay,
So what we
okay.
can
And
say
it's
is
not
provided with the-
tandem.
My only request is, we can discuss this, would be that we make it non-tandem.
So after the word standard size, put non-tandem parking spaces.
Yeah, but I know, I don't want to comment, that was my question for you, is that if you would be amenable to including that. So that's my only question. Thanks, Rachel.
So I have a question about the parking credits. How much is a parking credit to buy in this town?
I apologize, I do not know.
Expensive. I think they're expensive.
I guess the reason I'm trying to understand is because you could have a scenario where someone says, hey, I'm going to do this thing, put in that space, and then, oh, oops, I can't do it, so I'll just pay parking credits.
I mean, the parking credit's like thousands of dollars.
Okay.
So it certainly would be, it wouldn't be like a couple $100 credit. I just don't have the exact number, I apologize.
Well, I guess at a certain point, a developer's going to do the math and say, I can build a parking space, which depending on how deep you're going and whatever, it's $50,000. And, then if you pencil out, well, if it's $2,000 a year for a parking credit, well, I can pay parking credits for a long time.
I think it was a lot more than that. I remember.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question.
I don't remember how much it was, but I remember I was sort of thought, wow, that's pretty expensive.
Because I think that matters in terms of someone sitting down and doing the math, and I'm sure David would help us out with that. But you would say, oh, well, look, I could not build 2 parking spaces at 50 grand a space, and in exchange, I, pay a couple $1,000s a year in parking credits. That math could pencil out to be yay, why not?
So it would be a lot of effort on the part of the developer, certainly, because we would want an understanding from a car share organization that they have intentions to sign agreements with these people at the time that they come in to start talking to us in terms of development permit approval. We could require that the car share organization agreement be provided prior to certificate of occupancy, so they have to start with that agreement no matter what. And so if they decided not to, it wouldn't fall under, these allowances.
And where is that in here in terms of they have to have an advance? Because that was one of my other points, is that they've got to have an agreement in advance of approval.
So they don't have to have the agreement in advance of the approval.
But they have to have a letter of
that
intent.
they provide an intent to do business. That's not part of the legal requirement. What our plan was to put that in the application form so that it becomes part of the list of things that are required as part of the application to do this. We certainly could add that in as well.
I would certainly say that should be part of this language that, and we're getting into comments again without opening the public comments, but the reason I was asking the question about how much of the parking credit's going to cost is because that informs that analysis about whether or not it's cheaper to do. Which brings me to my next question, which is about the companies and how we qualify a company. I'm just going to sort of worst case scenario, a developer could say, oh, well, I'll just call my lawyer, form an LLC that's a rideshare company, buy a cheap car, stick it in the parking space, and yay, I've got a car share business. But it's not really a car share business. And so how would you recommend that we pre-qualify what companies, how many years of operation, size of business, something that would say this is a qualified rideshare company, or not rideshare, but
what we would use is the car share organization definition. So if you wanted to change how we qualified someone, it would be a change in the definition. I would highly recommend not putting onerous kind of requirements on qualifying them, because kind of the nature of what we're seeing today in terms of new companies popping up, I think is really exciting. And I would hate to require that a company be very large or have been in the business for a certain amount of time that would limit new companies from coming into our market. Because I think once you start putting those qualifiers, it very specifically starts to narrow it down to one very specific company that we already have present here. So I totally get your concern, but I think the reality is, yes, that with this, if a developer decided to go to those lengths and create a car share organization, that's certainly a possibility. Who I can see doing that, and it seems kind of wild, but like a nonprofit affordable housing developer that's an amenity for their building and kind of helps to reduce their parking overall and their demand for any of the spaces they have in the building, and they just buy the cars and have an app kind of thing. And it would be available to the public, of course, no matter what. That has to be available to the public. So it would need to be an infrastructure enough to handle that.
I apologize to Lynn.
Might take care of that, because the insurance will be very expensive.
Absolutely.
Revolving drivers. And we could also require that the insurance, proof of insurance, state on there that it is a car, a ride share deal.
Okay.
And I think that would pretty much solve that problem.
I want to apologize to everybody because I thought that the parking credits were really expensive. And I just looked it up, Googled on parking credits cost in West Hollywood. And it says the initial costs include an application fee of $650 and an annual fee for each parking credit of $405.86. The annual renewal cost for each parking credit will be adjusted by the Consumer Price Index each fiscal year. So it's not expensive.
So that's cheap.
That's very cheap.
So I'll pay the penalty.
Yeah.
You know, I said I was going to create the parking, and then I didn't. Oops, I'll pay the parking credits.
Right, and so that would only apply if they are in a parking credit district, which are primarily commercial areas. So it would be a very limited number of residential buildings or potentially hotels that has credits available too.
But I
so they
think
go
it's
pretty
something we need
quickly.
to pay attention to.
I mean, certainly. I mean, I think the realities of the parking credit system is it does what it's intended to do, and it creates an opportunity for people to essentially, right now, only commercial to, to pay credits into actual parking that's created. So the parking is there, and it's in a public facility nearby, and that works for commercial. Certainly, if you didn't want it to apply to this program, we could strike the parking credit piece.
I would. I think it's a false incentive.
I don't know why I thought it
We're
was
getting
more
ahead of ourselves. We're commenting again and not public. We didn't do our public hearing.
Right. Do we have
I
any
was trying to keep it
speakers?
to a question, and it kind of got out of control.
Okay, but we have no speakers at public hearing, so we can go ahead.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm trying to be good.
Yeah, and it also says that it's only available in the particular area, I think it's District 1 or whatever, which is along Robertson, San Vicente, Melrose, in that area, which there's high turnover and need at different hours.
And
So-
where there's a surplus of publicly
Parking,
available
yeah,
parking
parking,
spaces, like the
exactly.
structure here,
The structure and over, I think,
maybe Kings Road.
pavilion, second
Yeah.
floor, I think is part of it, and so forth.
All right, well then, that leaves my last comment, which is really that I believe from my reading of the council's directive that the goal was to incentivize more affordable housing. It was really to give people who wanted to build affordable housing a financial leg up by saving parking costs that would be cheaper to develop affordable housing. And so the goal was to actually incentivize more affordable housing. But the way this is currently written is it's essentially just providing an additional benefit to people who are already providing affordable housing under our existing code. And so if I had my way, this would probably be amended to say, if you provide affordable housing above and beyond your minimum requirements, this then tricks in. Because I think as it is, it's just like, well, I got to do the project we just did, we just approved tonight. They have to do one affordable, they're doing one affordable, they're getting their density bonus, but under this scenario, they could also remove a parking place and create one rideshare. Well, that's just an additional benefit. It's not giving us more affordable housing. And I think the incentive was to give us more affordable housing by creating an incentive that would make it easier for people to do so. So I don't think it quite achieves that goal.
I don't know
Perhaps-
if I can.
Perhaps if you require them to do a certain percentage more than their requirement of affordable housing. Not just one unit, but maybe 25% or 33%.
But it would be any additional affordable housing above and beyond the minimum requirements.
No, if you have a percentage above and beyond the minimum requirement.
The only issue I have is I think there are two goals here. One is affordable housing. The other is trying to incentivize people to use rideshare.
Right.
So, I think the idea, the way I understand it, and why I'm actually kind of for it, is, the developers providing their affordable housing on site, yay. And, you know, they're willing to provide a car, you know, think about it this way. Like, if you're providing, let's just say it's a regular apartment building, and you're providing a rideshare space on site, that means you have people in the public who are accessing this apartment building. It's actually kind of annoying. Just to be like, just from the operating this as a development, you know, you're gonna have, you don't have control of the property in a sense, and you don't know who's coming in or out. I mean, you do, you have the access codes.
Safety issue.
There's not just safety issues, it's like you're adding a logistical layer. So, I don't know, I think it's, you know, I think it's fair. I think this is a fair trade, and I think if there's a developer willing to provide car share as an amenity to not just their tenants, but to the public, I think this is cool.
The only thing I think that reading the original council directive, there wasn't any discussion about, gee, we want to promote car share. It was
It seems
entirely
like
about
this is-
affordable housing.
But if that wasn't what they wanted to promote.
Side benefit, potentially a side benefit.
Well, it doesn't seem like it's really about that. It's more about providing, limiting the amount of vehicles and promoting sharing.
Is the public hearing closed?
It's not closed, we don't close.
It's not closed, but there was nobody. I can close it.
I'm sure there are more comments, but I'm actually ready to move the staff recommendation.
Yeah. Okay, go.
So may I, or?
Yes.
Listen, I'm sure, sorry.
Motion by Commissioner Guy, seconded by Chair Buckner.
Including Commissioner Jones' language about the tandem?
Oh,
Yeah.
before, can we amend the, motion to include Commissioner Jones' concerns about tandem parking?
Yes.
Yeah,
and I-
So what we
Statement.
would do is add the words non-tandem.
Correct.
After, so it would read, for new construction of a hotel or structure with at least 10 dwelling units with required affordable housing on site, publicly available car share vehicles provided within the building and covered dedicated standard-sized non-tandem parking spaces located in close proximity to pedestrian access, et
Correct.
cetera.
And
Right.
can we strike the parking credits?
I'm okay with that as it is, in my current motion. Because, we can go ahead and.
I'm the seconder, so.
And the motion passes unanimously to recommendation to City Council.
Thank you.
Thank you. Going on to the next item, which is new business. And I see that under new business that we are going to be adding a special meeting of the Planning Commission for Thursday, August 30th, 2018. So I would ask all of us to make sure we mark our calendars, because that's an unusual extra meeting that year, that month. So August 30th.
Going to be on that agenda.
Yes, we are anticipating 4 items for that agenda. Your summer of meetings is quite busy. For the special meeting in August, we're looking at 2 subdivisions, a project with 3 new townhomes, and a zone text amendment, which is Rachel's, following up on the definition of dwelling units and extended stay hotels.
So to be clear, we have a meeting on August 2nd, we have a meeting on August 16th, a meeting on August 30th, and then another meeting on September 6th.
That's correct.
Okay.
Are we sure we would have a quorum
Well, so far,
Date,
on the proposed date?
30th.
is there anybody who's not going to be here on August 30th?
I'll be here.
I'll be here. I won't be. You won't be? Just one, and we don't know about Adam.
It's the Thursday before Labor Day.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Do we need to vote on it, or?
General consensus.
General consensus, I think we know one commissioner's not going to be here, and we don't know about Adam. And what about you?
I don't know either. I think I might be in New York. I'm not sure.
Okay, so what
Could
do
hold a meeting there.
can you all check your calendars and bring it back to the next?
Sure.
You're looking over it, David? Bring it to the next meeting, which is our July 5th meeting, and let us know so we know we have a quorum, or at least hopefully have one. Nothing on excluded consent calendar. Items from staff, are you going to do a planning?
Very
manager?
briefly, I just wanted to let the commission know of a change that doesn't impact you so much, but was approved with the council's adoption of the budget, which changes some of the functions of my division. So long-range mobility planning is now going to be renamed to long-range planning. The mobility function, which is Bob Chung, who you see occasionally with development projects, as well as Walter Davis, who's the city's neighborhood traffic calming specialist, will be moved with all of their current functions into the engineering division to consolidate some of our transportation planning and implementation work under one division. All the other functions that long-range planning has currently, so sustainability and land use planning work will stay as is, and the rest of us will stay in place.
Okay, so they're moving to the other department.
Exactly.
Okay. Public comment here. Do we have a speaker?
We have one public speaker, George Biarski.
George?
Hi. George Biarski, live in WeHo. I'd like to talk about community and the sense of community, how it works. It can be, the word can be sliced a lot of ways. Obviously, we're all part of the West Hollywood community. For me, there's also the community. For me, a few blocks west of Fairfax, with jumps to Poinsettia, certainly including Santa Monica in that stretch, but a lot of residential area. And above Santa Monica, Plummer Park, of course. And then there is my community, 6 blocks, Genesee down the middle, Romaine across, Santa Monica, whatever. I think that in terms of residential areas, I've been to a number of meetings, and particularly in terms of residential areas, there is some hope expressed by the Commission of a working between old inhabitants and new people coming in, and there has been basically a favorable view of, let's say, a building that is otherwise described as a mausoleum, but has a lower floor of glass for some interaction, interchange with the existing community. Low border parapets where people might get together and talk. For that 4-story blob that's going to be put at the corner of Romaine and Spalding, a cut-in from the corner with benches, for people to get together, whatever. This may sound a little negative, but getting together the old residents and the new people arriving, I don't believe this, is difficult. One, the buildings, 3 stories, are sort of put in an area of 2- and 1-story buildings. Areas of trees are removed. But the most basic point is that for the new buildings, I know a neighbor of mine lives right across from an existing new building. And he came out of one of these meetings, what's all this talk?
Your time's up, George. We're going to finish your thought and then we'll be done.
What's all this talk about community? I live across from this building, and in 6 years, I haven't seen anyone. I see cars going in and out, but no people. And, you know, as the city and the commission move ahead to redevelop and so on, there's a possibility for the residential areas, for some of the, that you're going to end up with a city of silence.
Thank you for your comments. All right. So, any items from commissioners at this point?
I have an item, actually. I just wanted to let everyone in the public know that it looks like our long-range planning subcommittee meetings will be ramping up. Those are held the third Thursday, typically, of each month. It's looking like we're gonna be having those meetings more regularly. I just want to ask staff if those are those noticed on the city website? So those are noticed on the city website, and if you do want to attend, they happen at 5:30, just before a planning commission meeting. So they are open to the public, so if you want to attend, you are most welcome.
And they're held here in this
Correct, in
body,
this room back here.
in the back room. Thank
So
you.
on a related item, I would like to request that staff publish the content of the long-range planning meeting staff reports on the website, just like this meeting is published, so that the public has access to that, those PDFs, et cetera. And so that we have access to those PDFs, because we had to ask for the PDFs in order to review them for this meeting.
So that you have them in advance of the meeting to review.
Well, and importantly, so the public has access. The public has access to an agenda, but they have no idea what the content is because they don't have access to the PDFs of the staff reports.
The city's website is in the process of being migrated to a new system over the next couple weeks, and once that's complete, we will ideally be able to post the full agenda packets for those subcommittees.
Great. Thank you. The next item is the adjournment, noting that the next planning commission, which would be held on July 5th, has been canceled for the 4th of July holiday, I believe. And so we're going to adjourn now to the next regularly scheduled meeting, which will be Thursday, July 19th, 2018, here in this chamber. And we have 4 items already on that agenda, so it'll be busy. Thank you, everybody. Have a good holiday.
see you in about